Hello and welcome to the inaugural podcast of Trauma, Healing, and Nutrition, a new podcast series sponsored by Repair. Repair is a health and disability justice organization based in Los Angeles, and I am your host and the director of the organization. My name is Beth Ribet, and I'm really excited to launch this series, which has been a good dream of ours for a while. So this first episode, I'm joined by my wonderful friend and colleague, Susie Hess, who is a clinical social worker and the co-founder of an organization called Trauma Informed Los Angeles, and she also is one of the faculty in the School of Social Work at the University of Southern California. And I've asked Susie to join me here today to just help start a conversation about this podcast, its content, its prospective audiences, and some of the subjects that we see as kind of recurring features. So again, I want to welcome Professor Susie Hess.
Thank you, Beth. I'm really looking forward to hearing what you have to tell us. And I do have some questions just to sort of start us off. Why trauma, healing, and nutrition? And what does each word mean to you? And why have a podcast about all three?
So that's a terrific question. Thanks for posing it. I'll start with trauma. So trauma is essentially the state of being in which a person has been subjected to experiences of harm that are significant enough to challenge or overtax their immediate coping skills. Trauma can be varying levels of severity from experiences that are perhaps traumatic in the moment, and then we are rapidly able to process them and release that trauma, to those that may take weeks or months to work through. And then there are more severe forms and levels of trauma that may become a constant in a person's life and be the basis for developing disabilities or illnesses like post-traumatic stress disorder or complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Healing is inclusive of a number of different possibilities and imperatives. So healing can be a very physiological process, and one way or another it usually is, and also a very emotional, sometimes spiritual process. And in this podcast, we'll certainly work from the premise that bodies and minds are always integrated and connected, so we're never really presuming an either or between the body and the psyche. But healing can also be a collective process. So healing can be about changing structures that are causing trauma or harm, bringing communities that have experienced collective harms together to participate in activities that are healing throughout, creating accountability and justice. That's also part of the process of healing. And again, it can happen at very small, localized micro levels or very large, systemic macro levels. And we sometimes talk about that in terms of positive forms of systems change or social change. And nutrition, and that's a really important one. You'll find a lot of conversations that are, some of which are really amazing, happening in the United States right now about trauma and healing, at least partly, though not solely, catalyzed by the presence of the trauma-informed movement, which has come to span a lot of different communities and disciplines and fields. But I started this podcast in part just because I noticed such a void in terms of conversations about trauma and nutrition, even among people who I think have excellent consciousness about trauma. I think that we have a lot more to think about. And to define nutrition, which was your original question, or to talk about what the term means to me, I think about nutrition as everything that the body needs to take in as nourishment. So nutrition can be, of course, food, but we also can get nutrients such as minerals through water. And we can get nutrition through teas and vitamin supplements and herbal extracts. And so the sort of array of things that essentially are about taking in nutrients or nourishment, all of that makes up nutrition and the field of nutrition, both as a sort of healthcare practice and then nutrition that's something that's communal and very individual and personal. So this podcast is linking these three things together and talking about the relationship between trauma and nutrition, always with an emphasis on or a primary concern with identifying and thinking through pathways to healing.
So interesting. And I think I'm one of those people who has a lot of knowledge on trauma and healing and not the nutrition part. So I am looking forward to learning. So what does it mean to address trauma through nutrition or to heal with nutrition? So how would that work, or what would that look like?
So that's a great question. And to answer it, I'm going to try giving a tiny little crash course on oxidative stress and antioxidants. And we've talked about this before, but I'm excited to share it with our podcast audiences. One of the things I find is that when you say antioxidant, everybody's heard that term and they can probably name some of them. Like most commonly, people will say vitamin C, right? And they know that that's an antioxidant, or they'll identify an antioxidant-rich food. So they'll say blueberries, right? Which is one people usually know is very antioxidant-rich, which it is. And then when I ask a room full of people, can anyone tell us what exactly is an antioxidant? Then it's like crickets chirping, right? Nobody knows, or they're sort of, well, they're good for you, right? There's this sort of uncertainty. We've all heard of them and we don't understand what they are. And to understand and have context for what an antioxidant is, we have to understand the concept of oxidative stress. And I'm going to explain that a little bit and try not to overwhelm folks who are not particularly science inclined. And then I want to talk about what does that have to do with trauma. So to explain the concept of oxidative stress, I want to bring up another term that you've probably heard and probably don't know how to define unless you're really somebody who's very, very immersed in health and medicine. And even then, it's interesting how many, for instance, MDs or nurses can't actually tell you what an antioxidant is. The term, though, that I'm thinking of is free radical. And a free radical refers to essentially an unstable molecule that exists in human bodies, and as part of its function, will try to remedy its instability by essentially robbing the walls of a person's cells of usually an electron, right? And so if it's missing an electron, it will imagine it, we'll sort of try to anthropomorphize or picture a free radical as if it were a person. It would be sort of an aggressive, grumpy person who was trying to work out their issues by stealing from others. We have a lot of models in our dysfunctional world of people who do that, whether they're nasty former partners or exploitative bosses or out-and-out colonizers, you name it. So picture this, and again, it's ironic that the term used to describe this unstable molecule is a free radical. I've always sort of laughed at that and said, really sounds like they're kind of picking on 60s era hippies. Like, I think they need a new name. So for myself, I will often refer to them as like settler colonists, right? Or we'll just say unstable molecules. But the conventional medical term is a free radical. So for the sake of avoiding confusion, that's what I'm speaking about. So you've got this unstable molecule, which if you remember from, say, taking a junior high or high school physics class, is essentially one of the smallest units of matter. and it's got this inherent structural instability. Something's missing. And so it goes and tries to repair itself by ripping out a part of the wall of one of your cells. And if it succeeds in doing that, it leaves a little scar or injury on the wall of that cell. And that injury is referred to as oxidative stress or oxidative damage. So this aggressive little unit of being has damaged something else in order to try to make itself whole. And human cells are pretty darn resilient. They can take a lot of damage and still continue to do their work. And we also keep making new ones. So we replace and repair our cells many, many times in every part of our body over the life course. So a little oxidative damage is hardly the end of the world. But we have trillions of cells in our body, and we have, an often, I would say, uncounted number of these unstable molecules that can come and damage our cells. So when enough of that oxidative damage accumulates, a number of things can happen. One is that a cell in your body will just be less good at doing the work it's supposed to do. So it might, let's say it's a cell in your lungs, it may not be as efficient or fast or as effective in filtering oxygen into your bloodstream. Or if it's a cell in your liver, it may have a harder time detoxing or breaking down fats or doing any of the work that it needs to do in your body. So it may just mean that your body doesn't run as well. Or the cell might die. Right? If it takes enough oxidative damage, it dies prematurely. And if that's happening too often, then we start to have deficiencies in parts of our body, whether, again, it's our brain, our heart, one of the major organs in our gastrointestinal system, our lungs. And so we'll see a sort of overall malfunction as more cellular damage causes actual cell death. And another possibility is that increasingly damaged cells become essentially less cancer resistant. And so cellular damage, oxidative stress can contribute to the start of cancerous growths in the body. So oxidative stress is linked to just about, in one way or another, every human disease. I won't say every, but even if it's not a cause of a disease, which it wouldn't be in every case, it affects our resilience and our ability to manage disease. It certainly affects our immune systems. And so oxidative stress is one of the major contributors to premature death, to people developing illnesses and disabilities. And so all of this is very alarming and interesting. But there's two questions left to answer. One is, what is an antioxidant? And the other is, what does all this have to do with trauma? So we've talked about oxidative stress. An antioxidant is a beneficial substance or compound which helps the body deal with, prevent, or repair oxidative stress. And it can do that in a lot of ways. So you can picture an antioxidant as being something like a therapist or mediator who says to this, if these little cellular players could speak to each other, will walk up to a free radical and say, there are ways to solve your problems without injuring anybody else. I can help you with that. I have a spare electron or maybe a hydrogen atom or whatever it is that you need. We can take care of you. No need to cause harm. Other antioxidants are more like paramedics or other forms of first responders or like nurses. They're coming in and addressing the damage and helping to repair it so that the consequences of oxidative stress are less long-term, less significant, and less far-reaching. And still others are more like really tough, amazing activists. So if you ever have, the image I always go to is like watching a line of activists with their arms linked, blocking off a side street so that a march can happen in a city. You want to picture these like, this is a shield, a barrier. You are not going to hurt that cell. So you can imagine an antioxidant as a defender, right? A defender, a protector, a healer, a neutralizer, right? And different antioxidants can play one or more of those roles. And we get antioxidants from all over the place. We get them, we produce them in our body. So vitamin D has a lot of antioxidant properties, and we can eat vitamin D, but we can also make it in part from sunlight, from exposure to the sun, which is really, I've always thought particularly amazing. And then there are antioxidants we barely know the names of. There are all sorts of interesting compounds in food and different plants, and aren't a commonly known vitamin and mineral, but may have really interesting, helpful properties. So this may already be starting to prompt understanding, like, hey, why is nutrition really important in thinking about like the very cells of the human body? But again, I still have to answer that initial question. What does all this have to do with trauma? And the answer to that is that, remember those free radicals or settler colonists or unstable molecules, however you want to refer to them, we get them from a number of places. We ingest them from pollutants, so they're in our air, food, and water. There's absolutely no way in our current environment to avoid taking in at least a significant number of them. We can try to reduce what we take in by filtering our air, purifying our water, drinking, certified organic, locally grown food, but we're still going to take in these substances because we've done a lot of damage to our environment. But we can also produce these free radicals essentially as a byproduct or consequence of releasing some of the hormones and other compounds in our bodies that we produce in order to deal with stress and trauma, right? So, for instance, cortisol is a stress hormone that has a really important function in the body. It is part of allowing us to deal with extremes that are a threat to us. But when you're producing a lot of cortisol, you're also releasing a lot of these free radicals into your system. And so the more you're subjected to trauma, the more your body becomes dangerously oversaturated with these essentially very dangerous little molecules that will start to tear down basically every system in your body. So this is all a roundabout way of explaining that trauma affects us at the most cellular level, and it affects every system, every part of our body, our neurology, our cardiovascular system, our muscular skeletal system, our gastrointestinal system, our respiratory system. And for folks who are going, that's a lot of syllables and a lot of scientific words, think brain, belly, heart, lungs, your muscles, your skin, you name it, right? Your bones. Every part of you is affected by exposure to stress and trauma. So since trauma damages your cells, and we need to repair and save ourselves in order to live and in order to avoid becoming much, much sicker or injured or more damaged than we otherwise would have been, nutrition is actually one of the most important strategic physiological responses that we can possibly have to trauma as something that's an enormous threat to human health. So that's the answer to that question.
Wow. That was incredibly informative. And I'm curious, just to understand more about what the scope of the podcast will be. Will it be focused on healing and trauma using good nutrition, or can you just sort of talk about that more of what we can expect?
Yeah, the podcast basically is going to have 4 core themes, and we'll move between different ones of them, and occasionally there overlap. So the first is to look at different types of trauma and then think through nutritional strategies to address those traumas. So we might look at, for instance, well, not just might, we will have an episode that focuses on sleep and sleep deprivation and sleep disruption and nutritional remedies or approaches to improving sleep and maximizing restorative sleep. And which is one of my favorite subjects. I think it's one of the ones that's so incredibly important to human health. So again, we'll look at sort of traumas and traumatic conditions and nutritional ways to approach dealing with them. A second approach is we'll look at particular foods, particular plants, substances, vitamins, minerals, you name it, and we'll learn about their different beneficial effects or ways that they can be useful for us, or in some instances, harmful effects. But a third category we're going to talk about is more about the politics of access to nutrition. So food insecurity, homelessness, hunger. Some of our listeners will doubtless know the term food deserts, which refers to lack of access to good quality, healthy food in impoverished neighborhoods, particularly like among urban communities of color. And so we'll talk about the ways in which access to nutrition is differentiated and inequitable and sometimes outright denied in different sectors of the United States. And we'll think about how that happens and what its repercussions are and how it relates to trauma and also, of course, what we can do in response. And the fourth category focuses also on food, but more about food production and food labeling and ingredients, everything to do, well, probably not everything, but many things to do with agriculture in the United States and other nations, with the ways in which the production of food is more or less conducive to healing, and also the ways in which the production of food itself can be traumatic. And for that, I'm thinking particularly of farm worker exploitation, or the ways in which the making and creating of food is particularly inhumane, whether to human workers or to animals, or particularly damaging and harmful to our environment, which can also then have traumatic consequences for all of us as it makes our environment increasingly polluted. So food and agricultural production and the different things that go into that are also part of what we want to think about. And I want to, again, reference the fact that healing is meant in these set of conversations to be an expansive concept, that our relationship to nutrition and healing shouldn't just be about our own personal, individual nutritional approaches or plans. It should be about having food, plants, nutrition in the United States and in the world not be a site of trauma, a source of trauma, that we should heal our relationships to food production, food distribution, food preparation, and food access. And all of that means really engaging a range of social problems, particularly around racism and poverty and environmental damage.
I'm definitely looking forward to hearing that and more. And I'm curious, what are your hopes in terms of what this podcast can accomplish?
Well, I think I have a lot of hopes. That tends to be true about a lot of things. But I hope that the podcast will be a source of vital and useful information to traumatize people who need particular pieces of information, but also just want to feel connected or supported or encouraged to really think about their own healing as, in part, a nutritional project. And then there's the way in which I think the podcast is an opportunity to, again, keep encouraging people to move back and forth between the local and the global, the personal and the collective, to think about the ways in which our collective well-being and healing is caught up in and inextricable from creating just and healthy relationships to food or food justice. So I hope that as well, that this will be a place that people will be able to come to connect around, again, their sort of own nutritional landscape and needs, and to engage with that subject in a way that's much more holistically connected to broader struggles for equity and justice and global health. It's a very expansive concept, but still one we need to keep talking about.
Yeah, for sure. And who do you hope will listen and tune in?
Oh, lots of people. Again, I imagine trauma survivors from a lot of contexts, hopefully connecting and feeling that you're part of the imagined community that this podcast and Repair's broader work is connected to. But I also definitely want people to be listening because they're caregivers. So people who work in healthcare, social services, legal advocacy, urban planning and policy, people who are trying to solve social problems to do with food, with hunger, with trauma, with violence. I hope we'll find useful tools and resources here. And so that's definitely a vital part of the audience. But I think the simplest answer is anybody who wants to listen is incredibly welcome.
Great. So my last question for you is, what could we as the listeners take as a first step?
Oh, that's always a great question. Well, hopefully come back as we release more episodes and listen some more. But I like the idea, and I've been thinking about, always ending with a little bit of emphasis on action or what it is that we can do about a particular issue we've been learning or thinking about. So I'll just talk about two things that are wonderful for people to remember and think about right now. And the first is that one of the best things that an individual can do to take care of themselves as they're managing and healing with trauma, and we all have some trauma, is to drink plenty of water. It's basic, but remember we talked about those unstable molecules damaging your cells. One of the ways, not just in terms of antioxidant activity, but in terms of getting those unstable molecules flushed out of your system quicker, one of the things that we most need to do is stay really well hydrated. And most people in the United States certainly are at least a little bit dehydrated most of the time. So I actually try, and some days succeed, to drink at least 100 ounces of filtered or distilled water. And that can include just water. It can include unsweetened herbal teas or other unsweetened, non-caffeinated beverages. We can still get some hydration from beverages like juice that have sugar, but you can't healthfully get all of your hydration from juice because that amount of sugar would create other medical or health problems. And similarly, caffeine, alcohol, though they contain water, also really dehydrate you. So usually you want to think in terms of having, again, beverages that are not sweetened, non-caffeinated, or very lightly sweetened is sometimes fine. But, those clear liquids, to have those throughout the day and always keep them flowing. Because, again, they're one of the most basic, helpful things you can help your body do to minimize oxidative stress and move trauma physiologically through your body. And the second thing that's just been one of my favorites for a while is cinnamon. So I like to get Sri Lankan cinnamon, which is also known as true cinnamon or sweet cinnamon, or by the species names Cinnamomum verum or Cinnamomum xylanicum. You don't have to remember that. But it's good to know that this is a really great kind of cinnamon, and it's not usually what you would find sold in North America. It's slightly more expensive, though not all that much, especially if you're buying it in bulk. And it does come, as mentioned, from Sri Lanka. It's sometimes also known as Ceylon cinnamon, referencing the city in Sri Lanka. And it has all the beneficial properties that cinnamon usually has, which includes it's antibacterial, it's antiviral, it is a mood elevator. I actually realized this one year when I was grieving the loss of a loved one very deeply, and just because I liked it, I had started making myself hot almond milk with cinnamon each day. And I kept noticing that I would feel a little bit of lightening of grief. And so I started reading up on cinnamon and learned in that way that it's a natural antidepressant and mood elevator. And it's also wonderful for digestion and can help lower and stabilize high blood sugar, which is one of the reasons it's often recommended for diabetics. But the reason I prefer that Sri Lankan cinnamon in organic form is that when you get the kinds of cinnamon that are usually sold in North America, commonly known as cinnamon cassia, it contains a compound that in more than moderate quantities can be very hard on the liver. And Sri Lankan cinnamon has all the good stuff, but it doesn't have much of that compound, so you can have a lot of it with no likely repercussions for most people. So knowing that cinnamon is just one of those things that can be trauma relieving and stabilizing and grounding and help you fight off sickness and help you actually digest and absorb the antioxidants in your food, and that it's antioxidant rich in and of itself, is one of the reasons I always want people to know how healing it is as well. Most people, not everybody, but most people like the taste. And so knowing that this is something that people actually enjoy, that's amazing for you, is really great to know. So we'll close today with cinnamon and water. And please come back for our next episode on strawberries and for our third episode, which is titled Hunger is Trauma. Thank you so much for being with us.